In the brutal wilds of frontier Texas, a 21-year-old cowboy set out to tame the land. With nothing but cattle, courage, and grit, Dan Waggoner began building a legacy. He fought rustlers, dodged war, and turned raw prairie into power. And when the time came, he handed the reins to his teenage son, a boy who would rise to become one of the greatest ranchers Texas has ever seen. From a single land claim to the largest ranch under one fence, this is the story of vision, risk, and empire. This is the legend of the Waggoner Ranch. Our story begins in the wild Texas frontier of the 1840s and 1850s. Dan Waggoner, born in 1828, moved west with his family during the era when North Texas was still open range and largely untamed. In 1849, at just 21 years old, Dan struck out to start his own cattle operation. The humble beginnings of what would become the Waggoner Ranch. At that time, Texas had only recently joined the Union, and neighboring Oklahoma was still Indian territory. The frontier was lawless and unforgiving. Settlers faced threats from hostile Comanche and Kiowa tribes, and cattle thieves prowled the range. Dan Waggoner learned the cattle business from his father in these rough conditions, and after his father's death in 1849, he was determined to succeed on his own. In 1853, Dan made his first land claim, 160 acres on Cattle Creek near Decatur, Texas. That date, 1853, is carved in stone at the ranch's main entrance today as the official founding of Waggoner Ranch. Dan's early ranch was modest, but the open range offered endless opportunity. He soon added 320 more acres in 1856 and steadily kept expanding. The young rancher often drove cattle further west as new lands opened for settlement. By the late 1850s, he and a 15-year-old enslaved ranch hand trailed a herd of 242 longhorn cattle and a handful of horses to Wise County, Texas. A risky venture given the constant danger of Indian raids and bandits at that time. But these risks were the price of building a cattle empire on the frontier. Through the 1860s, Dan Waggoner weathered the tumult of the Civil War era and continued raising cattle. It wasn't easy. The frontier was a place frequented by hostile Indians and marauding cattle thieves, but Dan's grit and savvy saw him through. After the Civil War, demand for beef in the North fueled the Great Cattle Drive era. Dan seized the opportunity of booming cattle markets and vast open land. He moved his herds gradually westward, following fresh grass and water. By the 1870s, he had pushed out toward the Red River region near present-day Vernon, Texas, establishing camps along creeks like Beaver Creek and staking out new ranges as Native American presence receded and settlers poured in. Dan Waggoner was not formally educated, but he proved to be a shrewd businessman and land baron. He reinvested his cattle profits into more land at every turn. He even branched out beyond ranching. His investments came to include 5 banks, 3 cottonseed oil mills, and a coal company. Enterprises that both supported the ranch and added to his wealth. By the late 19th century, Dan Waggoner had truly laid the foundations of a ranching empire. Dan Waggoner had one son, William Thomas Waggoner, born in 1852 and known simply as Tom or W.T. Waggoner. From a young age, Tom grew up in the saddle, learning every facet of ranch life from his father. Dan was determined to prepare his son to help run and eventually lead the growing ranch. The moment of testing came in 1869 when Tom was just 16 years old. Dan entrusted his teenage son with 5,000 head of wild longhorn steers and a crew of cowboys, and sent him on a cattle drive over 400 miles north to the railheads in Kansas. To finance the drive, Dan gave Tom only $12 in cash, 50 horses, all of them sore-backed and worn out, and his blessing. It was an almost inconceivable responsibility for a teenager. Guiding a massive herd across Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, at a time when that land was still home to the Comanche and other tribes. Is that the sort of chore you'd give your 17-year-old son? Dan Waggoner did, and young Tom Waggoner rose to the challenge. Amazingly, Tom delivered the herd safely to market in Abilene, Kansas, and sold the cattle for a huge profit. He returned to Texas with $55,000 in gold, a fortune in those days, worth about $1.2 million in today's money. Turning $12 into $55,000 in one cattle drive became legendary in ranching lore. That profit became the seed capital for the Waggoner Empire and proved Tom's mettle. By 1870, the father and son had formalized their partnership as D. Waggoner and Son, signaling that Tom, not yet even 18, was now a full partner in the growing ranch enterprise. Dan had effectively handed the reins to his capable son. As one account noted, Tom became a partner at 17, and by age 27 he had full reins of the Waggoner cattle empire. Tom himself later quipped about that formative drive. There I was with more than 5,000 big wild steers, 50 sore-backed horses, $12, and 16 years of my life. The experience forged in him an unshakable confidence and ambition. From his teen years, Tom Waggoner was exceptionally driven. He reportedly declared that his goal was to run the most cattle, breed the best horses, and work harder than anyone. Indeed, Tom's energy and vision would fuel the ranch's explosive growth in the coming decades. As open-range ranching peaked in the 1870s and 1880s, the Waggoners kept expanding their land holdings across North Texas. Dan and Tom aggressively bought or leased land in multiple counties to give their herds room to graze. By the 1880s, their domain stretched westward into the Panhandle Plains, south toward Archer and Baylor counties, and north to the Red River. They established large ranch divisions and line camps to manage far-flung herds. During this era, barbed wire was introduced, and the open range began to close up. The Waggoners, like other great Texas ranchers, fenced their spreads to protect their cattle and water sources. Conflicts arose with free-range herders, but the age of the big fenced ranches had arrived. The Waggoner Ranch's perimeter eventually enclosed over 500,000 contiguous acres, hence the famed title, largest ranch under one fence. With such size came challenges. Fence cutters, rustlers, and occasional clashes with remaining Comanche groups were realities. Dan and Tom joined forces with fellow cattle barons to tackle these threats head-on. In 1877, the Waggoners met with legendary ranchers like Burke Burnett of the 6666 Ranch, Colonel C.C. Slaughter, and J.A. Ranch's Jim Loving in Graham, Texas. Together, they founded what is today the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, TSCRA. This organization created a united front against cattle theft, hiring range detectives and lobbying for law and order, and it remains a cornerstone of Texas ranching to this day. By the turn of the century, the Waggoner operation was truly massive. Dan Waggoner had become one of the biggest landowners in Texas. When Dan Waggoner passed away in 1902, the inventory of his estate was astonishing. About 80,000 head of cattle and 525,000 acres of owned land, plus leases on another 100,000 acres in Indian Territory, Oklahoma. In terms of land under control, the Waggoner outfit was running cattle on roughly 625,000 acres at the time of Dan's death, more than 970 square miles of range. Dan died while on a trip to Colorado, and his death marked the end of an era. But by then, his life's work was in capable hands. Tom Waggoner inherited the entire ranch enterprise in 1902, becoming sole owner and patriarch at age 50. He would soon take the Waggoner Ranch to even greater heights, but also face new kinds of challenges. Before moving forward, let's talk about the Waggoner Ranch's brand, a detail beloved by ranching enthusiasts. Every great Texas ranch has a distinctive brand, and for the Waggoners, it was the 3 Ds. In the early years, Dan Waggoner branded his cattle with a reversed triple D symbol, 3 intertwined letter Ds to mark his herd. The Waggoner 3D brand, sometimes called the DDD brand, became one of the oldest and most famous brands in Texas, reportedly in use since 1849. There's even a bit of lore about how it originated. Some say Tom designed a single D brand that a blacksmith misread upside down and stamped as 3 Ds, while others suggest Dan added extra Ds to make the brand harder for rustlers to alter. Whatever the case, the triple D mark was long the Waggoner trademark. Interestingly, as the value of cattle hides rose in the late 1800s, the Waggoners decided to simplify the brand to a single reversed D on the animal, so as not to damage so much of the hide with a large brand. Despite this practical change, the 3D brand remained the symbolic identity of the ranch. To this day, the historic reverse D/triple D logo is synonymous with the Waggoner Ranch legacy. It represents continuity, an unbroken line of ownership and quality dating back to the very dawn of Texas ranching.